Hi there! So I'm here today to give a little bit of an update on my Winter Frost quilt. That was a quilt along that I did in December of 2020. So the reason I'm giving a little update is because I'm in the quilting stage of the quilt and I'm trying out a kind of new method that I'm going to kind of make up as I go along so that I can do custom patterns on different parts of the quilt on my home sewing machine, even though the finished quilt is going to be very big. So what I'll do is just talk you through, process so far, how I've gotten to this point. Then I'll talk about, this little tricky quilting situation that I'm planning to do and do a little bit of a demo of the quilting design that I'm working on to start. And there may be cats just wandering around in the video because that's just my life. I don't have my own sewing room and they're just gonna be in my way. And I'm gonna show you some pictures of the individual blocks on the quilt as I'm talking, just so you can have a little bit of eye candy other than this cat that's just here to ruin my life. So I was not planning to do this quilt along. I saw notices about it in mid-November and I was already in the middle of 2 other quilt alongs. And I was like, I don't need to add a 3rd one. I've got plenty of projects in my queue, don't want to overload myself, especially during the holidays. And I mentioned that to my husband and he's like, well, why not just do it? And I was like, well, okay. I just kept seeing these amazing little fabric collections that people were putting together and posting on this Facebook group. And I just love the color schemes people were coming out with and the beautiful fabrics. I was like, okay, well, I have to do this because I'm gonna die if I can't join along and can only look at what other people are doing. So I went to the store, kind of started stacking up fabrics that I liked and found a really nice combination of blues and purples and grays and I found some sparkly fabrics, which is exciting. Like I got a sparkly white and a sparkly sea foam color and a pattern with sparkles. And I thought that were really cool because I wanted to kind of look snowy since it's supposed to be like a winter frosty type of quilt. So really happy, got my fabrics in time to start December 1st. Every morning, I was just so excited to go on the blog on Moda Bake Shop is the name of the blog. I'll link it in the description. Go on the blog and see what was the pattern today? What was the block that I got to make? And so every night after the kids were in bed, it was my time where I got to work on the quilt block for the day. I also had bought myself an Advent wine calendar this year. So I was just living my best life. Every night, bust out my little Advent wine and work on piecing together the block for the day's pattern. And I just thought all the patterns they came up with were beautiful. I struggled a little bit on each one to figure out like, well, which fabric should I use for this one? Some blocks only used 2 fabrics. Some of them used 7 fabrics. And without really knowing what all the patterns were gonna be, I couldn't plan the whole quilt from the start. I had to plan it 1 block at a time. I mean, I could have just waited, I guess, till the end of December to see all the block patterns to start working on it, but no, I wanted to work on it as they came out. So I just did my best to kind of balance the colors within each block and then across the blocks. I tried to make some that were kind of darker overall, some that were more medium and some that were lighter, so that when I put it all together, there was good contrast and good variety. And I think I did a pretty good job. It's looking very good. So after I got all my blocks done at the end of the month, I decided on how I was going to lay them out. There was a variety of sizes that they released. So I made some 18-inch squares, which are pretty big, some 12-inch squares, and some 6-inch squares. And I had to decide how I was going to lay all those out into a single quilt. So I played around with different designs, finally came up with one that worked where my large 18-inch blocks were in the middle row with a few 6-inch blocks on the side, and then the rest of the rows were just 12-inch blocks with some filler. It's called sashing, the white strips that I put between all the blocks just to add a little more spacing. So I got my layout settled overall. Then I had to decide where each individual block was going, and that's when I first actually cleared out some space in the playroom so I could lay all my blocks on the floor and start moving them around and seeing what I liked. That was the first time I got to see them all together and I just loved it. And I eventually got a good layout that I liked. One thing that's nice to do, or something smart to do when you're trying to figure out quilt layout, is actually turn it into a black and white photo. And that way you can see whether the different, color values are balanced the way you want in the quilt. So it's giving the overall effect you want. So I went through a couple iterations of layouts where I was switching blocks around after seeing the black and white, being like, no, I don't really like those two next to each other. We need to swap some things around. But didn't really take that long to decide on a layout that I thought looked good. You can also see in the layout picture that I made these snowy peaks rows for the top and the bottom of the quilt. So these weren't one of the daily blocks they released. This was actually part of their like finishing instructions as an option. So I made these long rows of like mountains that go all the way across the top and the bottom. And that is actually what I'm working on quilting first. So that's why I've got it right here with me. So as I'm seeing all this layout on the floor and realizing this is going to be a huge quilt, and knowing that I cannot possibly try and free motion quilt it or even straight line quilt it on my home machine because it's just too small, I was like, okay, well, I could send this out to a long armor and tell them, give me a swirl pattern all over the whole thing or whatever type of pattern that I wanted. Or I could try and go find a long arm machine, get trained on it, and quilt it myself so that I can do my little patterns. Or kind of a cheat that I'm gonna do is a concept called quilt as you go. So this is where you don't make the whole quilt and quilt it all at the same time. You quilt different parts of it at a time and then attach them together. So, normally, just for illustration, I know a lot of you probably know this, but I did not know this before I became a quilter. So, we're always learning. So let's say let's pretend this is my big quilt top that's all pieced with all my patterns. What I would do is I would lay my backing fabric on a surface, add a piece of batting that's big enough, and then add my quilt on top of it. I would like safety pin these things together, and then I would have to quilt. So quilting is when you're actually attaching the layers together. It does not reference the piecing of the quilt top, which is what I've been talking about so far. So making all these designs and these blocks, that's actually just piecing. You aren't quilting until you attach the layers together. And I have a friend who started a quilt, never got to the quilting part, so he's not really a quilter. But yeah, so that would be the traditional method. But you can imagine that if your quilt top and your quilt sandwich is 8 feet by 6.5 feet, like my winter frost quilt will eventually be, I cannot possibly get that under this area and quilt it down to attach it together. So my thought is I'm gonna go row by row. So I'm gonna show you on my picture again. I left these only attached in rows so far. My plan is to kind of treat each row like a little table runner. And it's small enough that I can get it under and around the sewing machine and quilt cool designs. Then once each row is quilted, so the top of it attached to a batting layer and then quilted with my designs, then I'm going to trim down each row and attach the rows together attach the rows together and then put the backing on. And I'll put the backing on with just straight lines. So hopefully I can't get it in here, but we'll see. I was a little worried that doing it that way, you actually get the layer of batting in the seams, and I thought it might be a little bit bulky along those seams where you're attaching the quilted pieces together. But I did a test and I thought it was fine. Didn't really feel that bulky, especially since I'm gonna use a cuddle fabric backing, which is thicker. So it kind of hides the fact that there's a bulky seam underneath at certain spots. It seemed fine to me and was worth it so that I can do my cool designs. Plus, the other cool thing is I've been using up lots of batting scraps. So when you make a big quilt, you always have to make the batting piece bigger than your quilt top because your quilt top kind of spreads out as you quilt it down. And so you want extra, and then you always trim off that extra. And so what you end up with are these batting scraps that are just long, narrow strips of batting, which of course you can't really use for another quilt. But I save them because it's good to have for extras for practice on smaller pieces or table runners. But since all I need now to do each of these rows individually are long, narrow strips, I'm working through my old batting scraps, which is great. So I haven't even bought any new batting for this project yet. And as I said, I'm starting with my Snowy Peaks rows. So kind of just give you insight into my process there. The first thing I did is write or draw it on a piece of paper to try and see what I might quilt. And I can probably just pop this photo out actually, but I drew up what this strip looks like. And then I just started drawing some ideas I had for how I could quilt different parts of it. So I'm planning to do a free motion design on the narrow white border next to it and a different design on this teal border next to it. And then on the mountains themselves, I had some different ideas to kind of highlight the shape of each mountain. And so first I drew out some ideas, wasn't really sure what I was gonna like the best. So then I actually just took some scrap blocks that I had. Again, it's hard to throw out anything because everything just seems to come in handy. So I like to keep scraps. I tried some different decorative stitches that my sewing machine can do and just decided, you know, do I want to do just a straight stitch, or do I want to do wavy lines, or do I want to do like a cool crosshatch pattern up each mountain? I decided on a wavy line, and then I used another whole scrap to figure out what exact size of waves I liked, because you can actually set, you know, how steep, how like quickly the needle goes up and down, or in this case back and forth, to make the wavy lines. So I honed in on the exact settings and stitch length and wavelength and all that I thought looked really good on this size of mountain. And that is what I have been working on. So I would love to show you a little bit of that and then switch over to a different foot type and show you some free motion quilting as well. So we'll get to that in a second. Okay, so I'm ready to show you a little bit of this. I've already done most of this row, so I'm just gonna finish the part on the mountains and then show you how it looks when it's quilted, and it's looking really good. So I'm doing wavy lines up the mountain and down the mountain. Using what's called a walking foot for my sewing machine. And a walking foot is something that helps the layers of fabric go through at the same pace. Normally you've got the feed dogs on the bottom that are feeding the fabric through. But now this actually feeds them through on top as well, so that they go through at a steady pace. So what I've been doing is doing my wavy lines, then I switch to a straight stitch once I get to the bottom of the side, and do stitch along the seam, spin it around so I can go up the diagonal again. Okay, so I just finished the mountains on this long strip. This is going to be my top row of the quilt. So let me give you a little close up here. How about this? I'll show you. This is what they look like before being quilted. So this is just when they're pieced together. You can see the teal or the light seafoam fabric is actually a sparkle fabric, and also the white is sparkly, which is super fun. And then after they're quilted, they look like this. So you can see that there's those wavy lines that go up and down each little mountain. So up and down, about 5 up and downs per mountain. So I just finished that. Now I need to switch my foot to be a free motion foot. So what I'm gonna do is unscrew this. The walking foot is really good if you're doing straight quilting, or if you're going to use one of the special stitches that's built into your machine. The walking foot is great. It helps you achieve a really consistent stitch length and make all those different designs. But now I'm going to be doing free motion quilting. So this is where, rather than the machine feeding the fabric through, I will be moving the fabric around to make my pattern that I want to make. And this is also called a darning foot or an embroidery foot. It has a few different names. I call it a free motion foot. So I've added my free motion foot. Another important thing is that you have to drop your feed dogs down so that they aren't pulling your fabric through. Because if the whole idea is that I get to move it at the pace I want. So I will show you a little bit of that. Okay, so I just finished a little wishbone design on the white border next to my mountains. I'll show you what that looks like. So now I've got this kind of wishbone design going all the way down that border. And so I did that on my free motion foot. And I didn't draw it on, I kind of just eyeball it. After a little bit of practice on these types of designs, you just really get the motion down and you don't need to draw it on. It looks really good. I made sure to stay at least a 1/4 inch away from the rough edge because again, that's going to be sewn onto the next row on the quilt. So I wanted to make sure that my pattern that I just quilted won't get covered up when I attach the quilted pieces together row by row. Yeah, so I have a lot more quilting to do. I just started quilting this today and this is all I have done so far is the mountains and that one little piece of sashing in between. That's all I got. I'm gonna definitely show you a video when I'm all done with the whole quilt and I'll give you some close-ups on different designs that I did on the different types of blocks. You know, there's lots of pinwheel blocks and triangles and squares, and I'm just gonna have a lot of fun quilting different designs on the different areas. I'm gonna link below a couple of quilting videos from Angela Walters where she gives ideas on how to quilt those different shapes and different types of blocks. I really love watching those videos on YouTube. They give me great ideas, and you know, that's basically what I'm gonna work on. So can't wait to show it to you guys.